You know that parent who shows up to every school event, sits quietly in the back, never posts about it on Facebook, and drives home without saying much, but somehow always knows exactly what you needed before you even asked? That's a Gen X parent, and the world doesn't quite know what to do with them. They're not the helicopter parents hovering over every decision. They're not the cool millennial parents documenting every milestone for Instagram. There's something else entirely. Something harder to define but impossible to forget. And today, we're going to explore the psychology behind Gen X parents. Here's the thing. To understand how Gen X parents, you first have to understand how they were raised. Most of them came home to empty houses, both parents working, no texts to check in, no cameras to monitor the front door, just a key on a string around their neck and the weight of figuring things out alone. Psychologists call this experience emotional self-regulation by necessity. When no adult is around to process your feelings with you, your brain learns to do it internally. Your nervous system essentially builds its own scaffolding, and that scaffolding never fully comes down. So when Gen X parents walk into a room where their child is struggling, their instinct isn't to immediately fix it or post about it or call 3 people for advice. Their instinct is to quietly assess, hold steady, and trust that the kid can handle more than people think. It's not coldness, it's the deepest form of respect they know. The same respect nobody gave them, but that somehow made them stronger. And that's where it gets interesting. Research from the University of Minnesota on parenting styles found that children raised with what psychologists call authoritative warmth, where parents are emotionally present but allow autonomy, show significantly higher resilience scores in adulthood. Gen X parents didn't read that study, they lived it backwards. They were the children left to figure things out, and somewhere along the way, they absorbed a truth that took researchers decades to prove, that a little productive struggle builds something in a child that comfort alone never can. Think of it like this. A muscle only grows under resistance. Gen X parents intuitively understood this, not because a parenting book told them, but because their own childhood was the resistance. The twist is this. They give their children far more emotional support than they ever received, while still leaving room for the struggle. They are simultaneously more present and less controlling than their own parents were. That combination is rarer than it sounds. But here's something most people don't talk about. Gen X parents carry a quiet grief that rarely gets named. They are actively trying to give their children everything they didn't have: the emotional check-ins, the "how are you really doing" conversations, the presence at the dinner table. But sometimes, in the middle of all that giving, something uncomfortable surfaces, a voice that whispers, "Nobody did this for me." And that voice doesn't always sound like gratitude. Sometimes it sounds like exhaustion. Sometimes it sounds like resentment that has nowhere safe to go. Psychologists call this reparenting grief, the emotional weight of consciously breaking a cycle while simultaneously mourning the childhood you deserved but never got. It doesn't make Gen X parents broken, it makes them human. And it explains why the most giving Gen X parent can sometimes go suddenly quiet, pull back, need space that nobody around them quite understands. They're not checked out, they're processing something old in a moment that felt new. In real life, this shows up in ways their kids might not notice until much later. The Gen X parent who teaches their teenager to change a tire not because they're old-fashioned, but because they remember what it felt like to be stranded with nobody coming. The one who never says "I love you" easily, but shows up at 2 a.m. without being asked. The one who lets their kid fail a test, resists every urge to call the teacher, and then quietly sits with them afterward and says, "Okay, what do we do differently next time?" These aren't failures of warmth. They are warmth expressed in the language their nervous system learned, through action, through presence, through trusting you more than you trust yourself in that moment. And if you grew up with a Gen X parent and sometimes felt like they were distant or hard to read, it's worth knowing this. Their love was never the problem. Their vocabulary for it was learned in a different school than yours. Society looks at Gen X parents and sometimes mistakes their restraint for indifference. The parenting culture of today celebrates visible emotion, public affirmation, constant encouragement, and Gen X parents watch all of it with a kind of quiet skepticism, not because they don't love their children deeply, but because they know something the loudest voices in parenting culture often miss. Strength isn't always loud. Presence isn't always visible, and the most important things you give a child are rarely the ones that make it onto a highlight reel. What psychology actually says is this: the children most likely to thrive are not the ones who were protected from every hard thing. They are the ones who had someone steady enough to let them face hard things and survive. Gen X parents, for all their complexity and quiet contradictions, are often exactly that: steady, unshakable, there. Not because life was easy for them, but because it wasn't.
If this resonated with you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, did you grow up with a Gen X parent? And what's one thing they did that you only understood years later? Next, we're exploring the psychology of emotional unavailability, what it really means, where it comes from, and why the most loving people are sometimes the hardest to reach.